One of the more interesting aspects of the American government and a lot of European governments as well is we have a certain segment of our government that was actually never mentioned in the Constitution in the first place, but it's become such a integral part of our nation that it'd be hard to imagine if the founding fathers had not actually come up with the idea themselves. And what we're talking about is political parties, because when we first started this country, the idea was it was just not going to be a monarchy, and then not necessarily what it was going to be, instead, but just it wouldn't be that. And so the idea was to come up with the type of government that would actually keep us from, becoming that type of government. So what happens is that over time we start to create different, splits in our government, where one side wants one thing and the other side wants another, and that creates literally what's called our political party system. So when we first started, our biggest argument was even on what to make the Constitution. So we weren't trying to decide between Democrats and Republicans back then. Never even heard the terms back then. I mean, probably heard the terms, but not used in the context that we use today. But back then, literally the two parties were called Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And a Federalist was somebody who actually wanted, a strong central government, which would be your federal government, which kind of goes with the name, whereas an Anti-Federalist was against a strong federal government, thus being an anti-federalist. And so they kind of feared the idea of a too powerful national government. And so that's kind of why they argued for all sorts of things, including something like a Bill of Rights, which came along as part of the process to even make the Constitution happen in the first place. So in the very beginning of the country, we had this little split of of parties, but nothing really demonstrative as to what their significance to it's going to be. And so in the beginning, you've got Washington, who pretty much had almost a one-party government, and like nobody really had anything against him at the time. People had their different ideas, and politics is politics, but that was generally it. Then when John Adams defeats Thomas Jefferson, basically that kind of creates somewhat the split, with Jefferson bringing in a kind of a different mindset to where he thought government should be, and John Adams kind of continuing the same line that they were going when Washington was first in power. So after John Adams does his one term, Jefferson then wins the presidency, and we have the first switch in government with a president not actually fulfilling both of his terms. Although back then we didn't actually have two terms. You could serve as long as you wanted, but for the longest time, up until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, no president actually served more than two terms. So in 1820, they were called the Jeffersonian Republicans, and basically they split into two groups. So in 1850, the Whigs were absorbed. So in 1850, the Whigs were absorbed into the new Republican Party. Now, it's kind of important to point out that the names of some of these parties get reused and sometimes used by the opposite faction in the way that they change in the name of the government. An example is Andrew Jackson. He was basically part of the newly named Democrats, and he won against the National Republicans. And so, like I said, these names will change as we go over time. Not necessarily the meaning of what some of these parties stood for, but a Republican back in the 1800s is not a Republican in 2020. So just to give an example. And so same thing with Democrats, because there were a Democrat Party, which they're not the same people. They're not the same, well, obviously not the same people, but they're not the same mindset that they used to have. Although some of the ideas maintained, it's just the party's quite often switched and did all sorts of really weird things, throughout history. Even up to, literally 1860, when, Lincoln's president, the Republican Party is not the Republican Party that the Republican Party today actually, whenever they're calling themselves the Party of Lincoln, they're not even the Party of Lincoln, because the Party of Lincoln would not believe the same thing that the party of, like, Bush or Trump would think many, many years later. Yet sometimes that nostalgia factor kind of serves a pretty useful purpose to the parties themselves, because people generally don't know that. And if it serves a purpose, they'll use it. Not just saying Republicans, Democrats use the same concept as well. So one of the big kind of splits or changes in parties happens in 1932, and this is FDR when he gets elected. There are events that sometimes cause changes in party. So the Great Depression, was something that he was literally responding to, and so at this time, or up until this time, the Republicans were pretty much a really strong presidential party. Now, the House and the Senate changes all throughout history, but usually the presidency was kind of maintained by the Republicans. And so right about 1932, you have a change, and where the Democrats become a powerful party, at least for the presidency, and this continues on for many, many different years, with the switches going back and forth to where it was no longer set for one specific party was always going to be the presidential party. One party was always going to be, the congressional party. So there's been all sorts of switches back and forth, realignments. Those realignments are really important. We have another realignment that happens again, and this happens about like the 1865, which is the early, I'd say it's the first civil rights issue, but it's freedom of slave, or to free the slaves is what happens. And so basically that also causes a change in parties, to where a lot of people who are Democrats become Republicans, Republicans become Democrats. You have almost the exact same thing happen 100 years later, during the civil rights movement, to where a number of Democrats who basically didn't like the idea of, who were always for big government, suddenly become against big government, because basically it all has to do more with civil rights movements, or equal rights and all sorts of things like this. And so basically those parties changed as well. So there's a lot of people who changed their political party during that period of time, which had more to do with the race issues that were going on in the country than anything else. And so, which is kind of interesting, because that's been one of the big changes throughout our history as to why certain people leave their political parties. Kind of the biggest, strongest component of changing parties. But we've literally had complete realignments 3 times in our history, mostly over that particular issue. So let's talk a little bit about red state versus blue states. Now, to understand that, just understand that over time, the color blue was associated with the Democratic Party, and the color red was associated with the Republicans. And so what has happened is our interpretation of that, or usage of that, is now that we consider a red state to be a Republican state and a blue state to be a Democrat state. So if somebody starts talking about that, that's what they're talking about. You also hear the term purple states. Purple states are more kind of down the middle, or they can switch and go back and forth between the two, because they're not really set in the color, because the color is kind of like both the same. But there are different usages even of the term purple to mean different things. But usually in the general purpose, that's kind of what they're actually talking about. So we have a bunch of different changes that kind of happen over time. And so a good example is, if you ever look at an electoral map, is kind of see where all those different colors are that kind of take place. South usually generates a certain block of votes for one particular party, whereas, you know, the eastern and western states tend to form up for the other. And so, and then sometimes you'll have all sorts of mixtures kind of going back and forth. But then if you look at an election like the 2016 election, Donald Trump, he won more electoral college votes, but Clinton actually won the popular vote. So, but if you look at an electoral map, it looks pretty much like the Republicans just, like, you know, swamped everything, because it's basically just the outlier kind of states, but those states had so many people that makes a significant difference. And remember, if they have more people, they tend to have more electoral votes because it's based on numbers, how they actually give it. It's done on the census every 10 years. So keep in mind that's kind of how that actually works. Well, having talked about all of that, let's talk about another concept that kind of has more to do with the history of our political parties. And it's kind of how we came up with the idea of, or not the idea, how we came up with the concept of how people should actually vote. And we had a process called machine voting. Quite often it was associated with Chicago, because Chicago was considered like the machine capital of politics. And what the idea was, it's basically, it's a party organization that recruits its members and gives them tangible incentives. They're characterized by a high degree of control over all of their members and their activity. So basically, your machine is kind of the mechanism behind, you know, everything. So it's literally kind of running everything, and everyone's kind of like a cog in the machine. And so that's kind of how they work. For the longest time, if you wanted to vote Democrat, you voted a Democratic ticket. And you quite often didn't even get to choose people you were voting for. They gave you whatever ticket. And if you were part of a political party, sometimes they would just give you that ticket, and that's the one that you put into the ballot box. And all the votes kind of went that way. And so this was changed by a process called the Australian Ballot. And the idea was we could ticket split, you know, so you go in there and you could vote for a Democrat for this, or Republican for that, whatever you wanted to vote for. You could vote based on the people rather than the actual party itself. So this kind of changed the perspective and almost the incentive of voting itself, to where people stopped voting specifically just for the political party, you know, so where parties were the most powerful thing around, to where everything became candidate driven. So when people were running for office, they were no longer running as a particular party member, but they were now running as the office person, and then the party basically served them. Whereas it used to be the other way around, is they would run to become a part of the party, and then be seen on the ticket from that. And so it's kind of changed the perspective of how everything is. One of the other aspects of the Australian ballot that's kind of important to put in mind, or to bring to mind, is it also added secrecy of the vote. Because in the old days, like if they gave you that ticket and basically it says this is the way you're voting, everyone knew what you were voting because you got it. So they would have, you know, their poll people sitting there in the polls going, he's got a Democrat ticket, you know, so we're supporting him, he's on our side this time, you know, and so he can keep his job, or whatever their incentive was. Which they did, which you're not supposed to be able to actually do. But the secrecy of the vote makes it so that doesn't happen anymore. And because it doesn't happen anymore, when people are running for office, they have to be a lot more careful about what they do, and they can't just, you know, rely on the fact that they're a part of a specific party and hoping that everyone's going to, you know, just fall in line because they're a leader of that particular party. So it kind of leads to a bunch of trends that kind of happen over time. Like in 2005, when basically President Obama was running for office to become president, there was a huge lack of support, at least for the Republicans. And so, whereas before it was a pretty strong party and it was growing stronger and stronger, Obama comes along, and basically that support kind of dwindled, and a lot of it had to do with the administration before. the Bush administration was very unpopular with the people, including a lot of Republicans who would not come out in public and say it, but when it came to the actual election, what happens is when somebody doesn't support their own party, what they generally do is they just don't vote. And so quite often, in order to win an election, I've talked about this in other videos before, in order to win an election, you need to rally your support, which means if I'm a Democrat and I'm running for office, I need to make sure everyone who's a Democrat comes out to vote, because those are the people who will support you. Whereas if I'm an unpopular Democrat, I'm just saying if I was a Democrat, so if I'm an unpopular Democrat, then what happens is fellow Democrats don't come out to vote, and the Republican ends up getting more votes. So that's kind of how that actually works. So we've also had periods where there's trouble for the Democrats, like I mentioned, the Obama situation. And that happened literally within a year of Obama actually being in office. His support really went down quite a bit. It came back up later, but there was a period of time where it just kept going down. And so during the midterm elections, he lost a lot of support, which fortunately for him and his party, it kind of came back before the re-election. But they did end up completely losing the Senate, which has caused all sorts of ramifications kind of going forward. That's still kind of happening to this day as it is. One of the problems or one of the concerns that's kind of come out of all of this with these, and I'm talking about more recently rather than before, although the causes to this have been happening all throughout our history, is the idea of partisanship, to where partisanship becomes more important than the issues themselves. So it's like, if you don't care about, if you do care about certain issues like civil rights or abortion or whatever the issue that happens to be on your mind, but you care less about that than you do about the political party itself, sometimes you'll even accept, things you would not normally accept to have happen in your government in order to actually, promote the party. And so when partisanship gets strong, which has been happening during the last couple of elections, the ideas behind a lot of the things that parties stand for tend to kind of like fall on the wayside. An example is the Republican Party right now, which has power in the Senate right now, and it has the presidency. Its biggest problem, because of the partisanship that it actually has, is a lot of the planks of the normal Republican, background, like as in not wanting strong government and stuff like that, all of those kind of get pushed off to the side because it's much more important to stand behind the party than it is to stand behind specific things. Now, I'm not pointing fingers only at the Republicans. It's just because I'm using the Republicans as an example because they're in power at this particular moment. This happens pretty much anytime a party is in power. So, but usually what happens is your other party is supposed to serve as a kind of as a sounding board, or even as a they call it the minority party, but it's still supposed to serve as the counter to whatever the majority party is. And we haven't been having so much of that lately because what usually happens is in order to get things done, you would come to compromise with the other side. But since about little after Clinton, you really haven't had a whole lot of compromise on most issues. So like if something becomes a party problem, or a problem that the party doesn't accept or wants to deal with, basically it almost becomes, a dead issue that you can't go any further because two sides won't come to the same table and talk over issues anymore. So the only way to get anything done is to overwhelmingly throw it into the system and hope you can get the votes that you actually need. So one of the big problems we're kind of running into now, because partisanship can sometimes get out of control, and we're kind of on that point as we are right now. So, so I had a map that I kind of wanted to show, but I don't think I can do it in this atmosphere that I have here. but the 2012 presidential election just shows, like, you look at a map of Ohio, there's very tiny blue on the map itself, meaning Democrat, whereas most of it's like just completely redded over. I mean, there's just red everywhere on the map. But again, Ohio ends up becoming a Democratic state. Not always, sometimes it switches back and forth, but the reason is, and I've mentioned kind of the same thing when it comes to state, is the majority of the population happen to be in areas with high densities of Democrats with huge, dense areas of no people that were Republicans. So huge areas of Republicans, not huge numbers of Republicans. So that sometimes happens in these situations where somebody will look at a map and go, well, how did this side win? That's how it went. Remember, it's population that makes the big difference. So we should probably focus on what do political parties actually do. Because they come up with a lot of the ideas and stuff like that and put forth legislation when they're in power. But even when they're not in power, they're doing things, and that's usually their primary thing that they actually do is they select candidates. So from their people, they come up with the people who are actually going to run for office. And so they'll spend the majority of their time not just trying to get you to vote for them, but also to get you to actually turn out and vote. So quite often a political party will put together a huge drive just to build voter registration. And so, because that's a good thing, because the more people that they register, and especially if they're registering them, that means more people voting for their particular party. At least that's usually the theory. Now, most parties are supposed to register both sides, but they're not out in the opposite party's territory trying to get them to register. So, I mean, it's just kind of common sense practicality as to how that happens. And so what they'll do is, during a lot of this education process of explaining issues and all this, that's where they inform the public and quite often kind of push their agenda as they're doing it, because that's part of what they're doing. The more they spread their message, the more they can try to convince people they're the right people to put in office to get the certain things done that need to actually get done. So the way I look at it is, parties, although they can sometimes seem a little onerous and problematic for our system, they're also kind of, think of them as the glue that holds our federal structure together. Because without them, it would really be unorganized and very hard to get anything done. I mean, yeah, we could have a lot of administrators all over the place, but you got to find a way to get them in office. And parties have been proven to be the way to actually do it, or at least over time, that's how it's generally actually worked. So let's talk about, I mentioned minority and majority parties. Well, it's simpler terms than that probably appears to be, but minority party is basically the party with the fewest members in the legislature. So if there's 150 people that you put into office, there's much more than that. I'm just trying to use a round number here. If you have 100 of them that are part of the red party and 50 of them are part of the blue party, so you end up with the majority party being the blue party. I think that's what I said, blue and red. The one that's got 100, that would be your majority party. And the party that had 50 would end up being your minority party. And so remember, that's the minority party checks the actions of the party in power, kind of make sure that they're doing the right thing, and kind of keeps the public aware that, hey, not everything's going the way it's supposed to, or it is. They don't always have to talk about things being bad. And throughout history, there's been all sorts of kind of connections back and forth to that. So let's talk about, so one of the responsibilities that they actually have to do this is they run the campaigns. So during the elections or before the elections, the parties will get together and they'll do their registrations, like I mentioned before. They'll drives for new voters, and usually people who are volunteers kind of staff all the polling places. This is kind of how our government's been run before, because it takes a lot of people to make an election actually happen. And historically, we've kind of shown that it works, and it hasn't been corrupt. Well, at least not lately. There were a lot of problems before, but yeah. So things have gotten a lot better as we've kind of streamlined the whole process on how it actually works. But let's talk about midterm elections, because I did mention that, like, during the Obama administration, basically midterms elections came along. They lost a lot of votes. Well, during an election, when somebody's running for office, there's something that's called Coattail Effects. So if I'm running for president, because I'm running for president, if I'm part of the purple party, let's just use purple because it doesn't actually exist as a party, and I'm running for the purple party, what's going to happen is all of the people running for other offices, for the Senate, for the House, for, local dog catcher, everything that's part of the purple party, they have what's called coattail effects. Because if you went out to vote for me because I'm running for president, you stand by me, quite often what happens is people will then vote the same party of the other people, just kind of, voting down the line. They don't have to, but quite often they do, unless they really, really like one of the other candidates in the other parties for something else. But that's means they have to be very informed about all of these different candidates. And unfortunately, that is one of the problems in our country, is we're not really good at voter education. And so voters tend to go into the polling booth quite often not knowing anything about any of the candidates, and sometimes make choices based off of, whose name looks cooler. It has happened. So let's talk about, we have what's called party identifiers. People identify themselves as being a member of a party, and a party activist, which is basically, these are members who work for the party, kind of like the agents of the party. They may even become candidates for office because they've been part of the party structure for a while, and they become trusted members of the party. So why do people join political parties? Well, one is sometimes people just want to become part of a group. So there's basically solidarity, express mutual agreement with other like-minded individuals. Sometimes there's material incentives, which is patronage. Patronage. Rewarding the party faithful with, government jobs or contracts. If you work for a particular candidate, you might actually get a job in that person's administration, which happens quite often, because that's where they find the people. They look for the people who help them get elected and go, well, got to reward them. And generally, it's kind of how it actually happens. There's purpose incentives. Like, say you actually want to promote a specific set of ideas, and that one person running for office or a party that happens to be for that is basically going to side with you. So therefore, you choose that particular party and kind of stick with them. So a couple of things that actually happen as part of the American political party system is we'll have a national convention. There's a national committee, which usually has a national chairperson, person in charge, kind of running everything. There's usually somebody in charge of the party itself. Depends on different periods in time with parties, at least for the two major parties. And also they'll have congressional campaign committees that'll be in their political party itself. And then if they get into power, they're basically part of the larger structure itself when it comes along. So what will also happen is the party will get together, have their big meeting and everything, and they create what's called a party platform. That party platform is basically all their ideas, their party positions on various issues. This is basically the kind of promise of they're going to carry out this stuff when they win the presidency. During when a number of new people kind of came into Congress during the Clinton administration, which basically was called the Contract with America. And so a bunch of members of Congress of the Republican Party all made this contract to where they actually decided to do a certain amount of things that would get taken care of within a certain amount of days after they took office. And that became a really important kind of thing because it was their promise, their contract with America, and they had to make sure they actually carried it out. Not a lot of it was accomplished because the other side was very much against trying to make it happen, but they attempted to get a lot of the things done, because when you make a contract with America like that, you kind of have to go through the motions of actually trying to get it done. So we've had a kind of a problem last number of elections or last number of presidencies to where promises are made and nothing's actually done about it. And so people start distrusting government. And so when that happens, it becomes very hard to make promises and to cause people to vote on that, especially when they don't believe you're actually going to come through for it. So that's our two-party system. But remember, we have more than two parties. We have three parties. Well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. We have more than three parties. We have at least three parties, which means we can have a million parties. And there's no limit to how many you can actually have. It's just depending on how many have different ideas they want to do. The problem with all of that is third parties have almost zero chance of any power in this government whatsoever. They might get, a House seat from time to time, but generally, if you're not part of the Republicans or the Democrats, you're basically not part of the government, because the rest of America doesn't take them seriously. It's just kind of historically how it's worked. Now, there's been a couple of them that have gotten some kind of attention, and during presidential elections, they might get a couple of electoral votes here and there. Like if you go back to Ross Perot, he picked up a couple of, couple of attempts to get it. So, but the problem, and he got enough votes to where the party was seen as viable for being able to continue into the next election with actual funding and everything, but still was considered, inconsequential and not important enough to actually, cause anyone to think they had a chance at becoming president or even influencing who became president. So why do third parties come along? I mean, because we have what's called a winner-take-all system, which means whoever wins gets everything. And that's kind of how a winner-take-all system works. And that even works, because we have single-member districts and stuff, which is another problem, which doesn't really help when you don't have like proportional representation, which you do in many European countries. So again, what incentive does a third party actually have in American politics? Well, quite often they're issue-oriented parties. This is one of the most important ones, which basically they're formed to promote a particular cause or a timely issue. Problem with that is if the issue gets solved, or if one of the major political parties picks up the issue, the party really has no reason for being anymore, and they kind of dissolve pretty fast. And usually that has been the history. If a third party came along and wanted some specific issue, as part of their agenda, or it was their agenda, one of the two major parties just takes their idea, adds it to their regular platform, and then basically takes all of the support that they originally had going into the election. This happened right up until Ralph Nader ran for the Green Party, and the idea was, or at least the thought was, during Al Gore's election, that what would happen is the Democrats would take all of his ideas and incorporate them into their agenda. They didn't. And what ended up happening is the Green Party became pretty strong, but it also disrupted the election so bad that basically the Democrats did not recover and lost the election. So that's what can kind of happen if you don't support them. Same thing happened with Ross Perot. There's a bunch of issues that Bush did not follow up on that needed to be followed up on that the Republicans would normally do that Ross Perot was, clamoring for. Some of the ideas didn't even actually get picked up until Trump came along. And so, but the idea is they lost a lot of support and literally lost the election, which is why Bush was a one-term president. Also, one of the other kinds of third parties that we have, as I mentioned, issue-oriented parties, is ideological parties. Basically, they have a specific political doctrine or a set of beliefs. There's been a couple of religious parties, that run on a particular religion. They don't go very strong because their support is minimal at best. Or splinter and personality parties, which is kind of what Ross Perot was, although he did have a political agenda. He was more seen as kind of like a wild card kind of a person, and so that's why he got a lot of support. As a matter of fact, you could even say that about Ralph Nader, who basically had a strong reputation as a, during his fight back days, going back after the system. And so people were seeing that more than they were actually seeing Green Party, although he was the head of the Green Party for that particular election. So kind of even dwindled the Green Party message to where people didn't even equate the two of them together. So there's been very little effect of third parties over the years because they haven't had enough effect or enough support in order to make a difference. Theodore Roosevelt was basically, Bull Moose Party kind of came along, and the last real showing of a strong third party that could actually pick up electoral votes. And so it's basically these days they can affect the vote in the very end, but usually they're not going to get any electoral votes and they're not going to become president. And so it tends to provide a voice for dissatisfied Americans. So that's just the basics of political parties and kind of some of the things that we focus on when we're dealing with them. We have a long history in this country of political parties, and I can't tell you that in the next 4 years we won't have a complete, changeover in parties again. Might even have completely different names, and Democrats and Republicans might be considered old hat names that nobody uses anymore. Our system is constantly changing, it's evolving, and it basically whatever America needs at that particular time is what America actually becomes. So that's kind of what our political system is, and what our political parties are, is their responses to our political needs and where they're used to fulfill whatever those needs might actually be.